What if I told you the most powerful families in history were also their most fragile? For centuries, royal blood was considered sacred, untouchable, divine, and too pure to be mixed with the blood of commoners. To keep it that way, Europe's monarchs turned their family trees into tangled webs of cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, and incestuous alliances that spanned generations. On paper, it preserved power. In reality, it bred monsters, martyrs, and madness. They were crowned in gold, wrapped in velvet, and buried in secrets. This is not the fairy tale version of royalty. This is the side hidden in locked archives and whispered behind silk curtains, where kings drooled through misshapen jaws. Queens watched their sons bleed to death from bruises, and emperors saw ghosts in courtrooms, screaming prophecies only. They could hear the royal inbreeding didn't just cause strange medical anomalies. It created disasters so horrific they shifted the balance of global power. These were not isolated medical curiosities. They were ticking genetic bombs passed from cradle to cradle, throne to throne, until entire empires collapsed under the weight of blood that was too pure to survive. This is the true story of how inbreeding cursed some of history's most powerful dynasties, and how the pursuit of perfect lineage created the most disturbing situations the world has ever seen. We begin not with a war, but with a jaw. He was the king of the largest empire in the world, and yet he couldn't eat without choking. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 into the legendary Habsburg dynasty, a royal house that had ruled across Europe for centuries. But by the time he reached the throne, the Habsburgs weren't ruling with iron fists anymore. They were surviving on borrowed time, and Charles was the final, tragic product of over 200 years of cousin marriages that had turned their family tree into a noose. His face told the story before he ever spoke. A grotesquely elongated lower jaw, famously known as the Habsburg jaw, jutted forward so far that his upper and lower teeth never met. This wasn't just a cosmetic defect. It meant Charles couldn't chew. Every bite of food had to be mashed into pulp by his servants. Even then he choked often. Swallowing was an ordeal. Speaking was worse. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his speech an unintelligible mumble. Foreign ambassadors had to rely on court interpreters just to understand their king. Ministers struggled to hold meetings when the monarch couldn't be understood. But the jaw was just the start of the horrors. Charles drooled constantly, a thin string of saliva often stretching from his lower lip onto the royal robes he wore. He had to be wiped, managed, hidden. Every court appearance was a carefully staged event, a performance designed to conceal a body that had already failed and a mind that never developed, because Charles wasn't just physically broken, he was mentally locked in childhood. He played with toys during state meetings. He threw tantrums when courtiers contradicted him. He judged policies not by their merits, but by how amusing the advisors were when they explained them. But despite all this, the court had one demand, an heir. Charles married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a young woman who arrived in Madrid full of hope and left in a coffin, childless and reportedly miserable. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Court doctors documented a growing list of desperate, humiliating attempts to cure his infertility, from sacred oils rubbed into his groin, to whispered prayers, to hired mystics who claimed to break ancient curses. None of it worked. Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was completely impotent. Behind the closed doors of his palace, his health continued to collapse. He suffered from seizures that left him unconscious and foaming at the mouth. Minor colds turned into life-threatening illnesses. His immune system was so dysfunctional that he was frequently bedridden for weeks. And then there was the diarrhea, chronic, uncontrolled, public. Servants followed him during court appearances with linens and perfumes, ready to hide the accidents that came without warning. One visiting French diplomat wrote that the odor of the court is unlike anything in Europe, more mausoleum than monarchy. When Charles died in 1700 at the age of just 38, his doctors performed a full autopsy. What they found was beyond tragic. It was nightmarish. His heart was the size of a dried peppercorn. His lungs were black and rotting. His kidneys were fused into a single misshapen organ. He had only one testicle, and it was shrunken, blackened, and necrotic. One court physician reportedly muttered, "It is a miracle that this man ever lived." But the miracle came with a cost. Charles II's death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that dragged on for over a decade, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and redrew the political map of Europe. But the real war had started long before, inside the bloodlines of the Habsburgs themselves. For over 200 years, the family had married close cousins, aunts, uncles, even nieces, in a bid to keep their blood pure and their lands intact. What they created instead was a genetic dead end, a dynasty so inbred that by the time of Charles's birth, his inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how genetically similar your parents are, was higher than that of a child born to a brother. And Sister Charles was the final page of a long, crumbling chapter. He never ruled. He merely lasted. And in his story, we see the terrifying cost of royal inbreeding, a boy born to rule half the world. Who couldn't even eat without help? She looked like a harmless grandmother, dignified, proper, and endlessly painted in black. But Queen Victoria didn't just rule an empire. She silently infected it. Hidden in the DNA of the woman who gave her name to an age was a lethal mutation. Hemophilia B, a blood-clotting disorder that turned small cuts into fatal wounds and bruises into ticking time bombs. And because hemophilia rides the X chromosome, it has a cruel gendered pattern, passed quietly by mothers to sons, killing generation after generation of male heirs while their mothers watched helplessly from beside the throne. Victoria had 9 children, and unknowingly she turned nearly all of them into genetic time bombs. Her daughters married into the ruling houses of Germany, Spain, and Russia, each union carrying not just political value but biological risk. The disease didn't show itself at first. Hemophilia is rare, vanishingly so, in the general population, and most doctors in the 19th century had never seen a case. But as royal sons across Europe began dying from bruises and nosebleeds, panic spread behind palace walls. The first true victim was Prince Leopold, Victoria's own son. He lived his life surrounded by cushions. He couldn't play sports, he couldn't ride horses. He had to descend stairs with guards on both sides. Even slipping in the bathtub meant a week of agony. When he died at 30 from internal bleeding. After a minor fall, the court described it as a tragic accident, but it wasn't an accident. It was inheritance. Then came Princess Alice's son, Friedrich, in Germany, dead at 2 years old after falling from a window and bleeding uncontrollably. from a cut on his ear. And in Spain, Prince Alfonso, heir to the throne, bled to death in a car accident that shattered his knee, a wound that would have been survivable for any other young man, but the most devastating. Transmission happened in Russia. Princess Alex of Hesse-Victoria's granddaughter married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and became Empress Alexandra. She brought the hemophilia gene with her, hidden, silent, until 1904. When she gave birth to the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne, Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov. At first, the birth was a miracle. The Romanovs had finally produced a male heir after 4 daughters. But within months, that miracle began to bleed. A minor bump on the leg turned into swelling the size of a grapefruit. Alexei's joints filled with blood. His screams echoed through the marble halls of the Alexander Palace day and night. Sometimes his lips turned blue. Sometimes he passed out from the pain. Sometimes he simply asked his mother if he was going to die. Nicholas and Alexandra were paralyzed with fear. Russia had never had a hemophiliac ruler. The disease was kept a state secret. Courtiers were sworn to silence. Portraits were carefully staged to hide the bruising. Public appearances were scripted with military precision. Doctors hidden in the crowd, guards nearby to catch him if he stumbled. He rarely walked alone. The desperation for a cure opened the gates to madness. In 1905, into the heart of the Russian monarchy walked a wild-eyed mystic from Siberia, Grigory Rasputin. Filthy, foul-smelling, and accused of everything from sorcery to seduction, Rasputin claimed he could ease Alexei's pain, and somehow he did. Whether by hypnosis, coincidence, or the calming of Alexandra's nerves. The boy's bleeding episodes slowed when Rasputin was present. For Alexandra, this was divine. For Russia, it was a disaster. Rasputin began wielding real political power. He influenced cabinet appointments. He dictated policy decisions. He whispered in the ears of a desperate empress while courtiers and generals fumed. The people saw a corrupt, decadent monarchy, one ruled not by divine right but by superstition and fear. They didn't know about the bleeding boy behind the palace walls. They only saw weakness, and that weakness helped fuel a revolution. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. Nicholas abdicated. The entire family was arrested. And on the night of July 17, 1918, Tsar Nicholas, Empress Alexandra, their 5 children, including the fragile 13-year-old Alexei, were executed. In a basement in Ekaterinburg, it would be decades before the world learned the truth that one of the largest empires in history had been brought to its knees, in part by a genetic disease that had traveled across Europe in a queen's blood. What makes hemophilia especially cruel is its invisibility. Carriers show no symptoms. Generations can pass without incident until suddenly a child appears who can't stop bleeding. This pattern meant that royal families thought the danger had passed, only to see it reappear in their sons or grandsons. Hemophilia is a ghost, quiet, hereditary, and merciless. By the 1920s, the disorder had embedded itself across nearly every major European monarchy. Britain, Spain, Germany, Russia, all had royal boys born into luxury and raised in fear of a scraped knee. Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, had unknowingly launched a medical crisis that lasted nearly a century. In portraits, she looked serene, lace, pearls, morning dress. But behind that image lies a genetic shadow. one that spilled across continents and soaked royal cradles in blood. In 1904, the Russian Empire celebrated. The long-awaited male heir had finally been born, Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov-Tsarevich. Of all the Russias, after 4 daughters, Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra were overjoyed. Their dynasty, one of the oldest and most absolute monarchies in Europe, finally had a future. 505, but beneath the celebration, a secret bled quietly into the royal nursery. Alexei had inherited hemophilia, the same genetic curse carried silently by his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. With a single X chromosome gone wrong, Russia's future ruler was doomed. He would live not like a prince, but like porcelain, untouchable, delicate, always a breath away from death. The first time it happened, he was just a baby. A small bump on his thigh led to internal hemorrhaging. His skin turned deep purple. His screams pierced the palace walls. The court physicians, confused and powerless, could only wait and pray. Alexandra, already anxious and devout, spiraled into fear. Her son's body was breaking, and no one could stop it. The Romanovs tried to hide the truth. After all, the Tsar was supposed to rule by divine right. What did it say about God's favor if the heir to the throne could be killed by a bruise? Alexei's public life became a performance. When he appeared at military parades or church services, guards followed discreetly. Carpets were laid, chairs placed nearby in case he stumbled. Servants were trained not just in etiquette, but in emergency bleeding control. He was, in every way, a prisoner. A little boy trapped inside the brittle expectations of monarchy and the silent terror of his own body. Then, in 1905, something strange happened. After a particularly severe bleeding episode, Alexandra, desperate for help, summoned a mystic from Siberia. His name was Grigory Rasputin, a wild-eyed peasant with filthy robes, hypnotic eyes, and rumors trailing behind him like smoke. He claimed to have divine powers. He said he could help the boy, and somehow he did, whether it was hypnosis, luck, or simply the calming effect his presence had on the Empress. Rasputin's arrival often coincided with the boy's recovery. When doctors failed, Rasputin soothed. When Alexei moaned in pain, Rasputin sat beside him and whispered prayers, and the bleeding slowed to Alexandra. This wasn't coincidence. It was divine intervention, and from that moment forward, Rasputin became more than a healer. He became the most powerful man in Russia. He moved into the royal inner circle, bypassing ministers, influencing appointments, manipulating Alexandra with a mix of religious language and psychological control. His unwashed presence haunted the court. His enemies accused him of orgies, drunken rages, and blasphemy. And yet, every time Alexei bled, the Empress summoned him. Russia burned with rumors, whispers spread across St. Petersburg. Why was this dirty monk so close to the Empress? Why did she dismiss generals and elevate Rasputin's allies? Why was the heir to the throne rarely seen? But no one dared say the truth, that the monarchy was hiding a bleeding child and clinging to a mystic because he was the only thing standing between a family and complete genetic collapse. The people didn't know about the disease. They only saw weakness, corruption, and strange decisions at the top. During World War I, while Russian soldiers died by the thousands at the front, Rasputin was helping appoint cabinet members to the Russian public. The monarchy looked possessed, out of touch, drowning in mysticism and deaf to the cries of the people. And then, revolution in February 1917, the Romanov dynasty collapsed under the weight of war, hunger, and mistrust. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The imperial family was placed under house arrest, and the secret of the bleeding prince traveled with them to Siberia. Even as prisoners, the family tried to maintain dignity, but the boy's illness continued. Alexei could barely walk. His joints were stiff, permanently swollen from past hemorrhages. His sisters carried him when he couldn't move. He smiled less. His body, ravaged by years of internal blood poisoning, was failing. On the night of July 17, 1918, the family was woken before dawn. They were told they were being relocated. Instead, they were led to a basement in the town of Ekaterinburg. There, under the yellow light of a naked bulb, they were executed by Bolshevik soldiers. Bullets ricocheted off the Serena's corset, stuffed with jewels for escape. The daughters were bayoneted, and Alexei, frail, half dead already, was shot where he lay. A family line that had ruled Russia for over 300 years was erased in one night. And yet, the most haunting part of the Romanov story is not the execution, it's the fact that the entire collapse might never have happened if one grandmother hadn't passed on a silent gene. And if one little boy hadn't been cursed to bleed. Rasputin is remembered as a villain, but in truth he was a symptom, a walking result of royal desperation. The real villain was something no bullet could kill. A single mutation on a single chromosome, carried like poison from generation to generation until an empire bled out. He ruled the largest empire in the world. He also talked to trees, held conversations with ghosts, and believed England had been swallowed by the sea. King George III of Great Britain wasn't born mad. His descent into psychological chaos was slow, terrifying, and entirely avoidable, because at the root of his unraveling wasn't just stress or politics. It was a rare genetic disorder, triggered and magnified by centuries of royal inbreeding. The condition was called acute intermittent porphyria, a rare blood disorder that alters the body's ability to process certain chemicals. The result is horrific, agonizing stomach pain, neurological collapse, hallucinations, delirium, violent mood swings. In George's case, it meant losing not just his mind, but his grip on an empire. His first major breakdown happened in 1765. Just as tensions with Britain's American colonies were rising. Instead of listening to advisors or negotiating with colonial leaders, George began experiencing what his doctors called fits of madness. He ranted for hours. He repeated words obsessively, his pupils dilated, his urine turned red and purple. A telltale sign of PORPHYRI. Ministers were baffled. One wrote in his private notes, "He is not present. The body sits, but the mind is elsewhere." At the time, medicine had no answers. Physicians resorted to medieval torture disguised as treatment, blistering, ice baths, leeches, and straitjackets. George was isolated, bound, and burned in the name of care. None of it worked. His mind continued to deteriorate. During his worst episode in 1788, the king became fully delusional. He claimed to see angels in the curtains. He shouted at portraits. He attacked his own son. Parliament, panicked, began debating whether to remove him permanently and install the Prince of Wales as regent. The newspapers called him simply the Mad King. But here's what history doesn't teach often enough: his madness may have changed the world. During the critical years of the American Revolution, George III's decisions were marked by rage, paranoia, and an inability to compromise. Colonists, who demanded fair representation, were met with inflexible resistance. Reasonable petitions were ignored. His own ministers described him as erratic and unreachable. British historians now debate if George had been mentally well, could the colonies have been kept? Could diplomacy have replaced war? Instead, Britain lost its most valuable territory, and George's personal breakdown mirrored the beginning of imperial decline. But George's madness didn't come from nowhere. It was inherited, likely from earlier generations of intermarried royal bloodlines, particularly through the House of Hanover and earlier Stuarts, both of which had practiced tight familial marriages for generations. The inbreeding didn't just trap facial features, it trapped rare, recessive diseases like porphyria deep inside the bloodstream of a monarchy, and George passed it on. His son, George IV, was plagued by erratic behavior, substance abuse, and deep depression. His granddaughter, Queen Victoria, became the silent carrier of hemophilia. The sickness didn't stop with one man. It seeped through generations like ink and water. In his final years, George lived in near total darkness. He was blind, he was deaf, he no longer recognized his family. He wandered the halls of Windsor Castle, speaking to people who weren't there. He sang hymns at the wrong times. He wept without cause. A visitor in 1818 wrote, "He is not king, nor father, nor man. He is a relic of a mind once great, now dissolved into shadow." George died in 1820, alone in body and mind. He ruled during the rise of Napoleon, the fall of the colonies, and the transformation of Europe, but spent the last decade of his reign in a mental fog so deep he barely noticed. Today, porphyria is treatable. A simple genetic test can identify it. Injections and lifestyle changes can manage it. But in George's time, the condition was a death sentence for the mind. And the irony, it was the royal obsession with pure bloodlines that helped concentrate this rare disorder in the first place. Britain's monarchy didn't just lose America. It lost its king to his own DNA. At night, her screams echoed through the palace walls. They said you could hear her prayers from 3 rooms away, whispered at first, then shouted. Sometimes she was begging, sometimes she was laughing, but most often she was crying for forgiveness, crying for the souls of her children, crying because she believed God was coming for her. Queen Maria I of Portugal wasn't mad from birth. In fact, she began her reign in 1777 as a highly educated, deeply religious, and determined monarch. She was Portugal's first queen regnant, beloved by her people, and known as Maria the Pious for her devotion to Catholicism. But within 10 years, something began to unravel. It started slowly, with extended fasts and sleepless nights spent praying. Then came the paranoia. Maria believed demons had entered her court. She heard whispers behind closed doors that no one else could hear. She wept for hours, convinced that she and her entire family were damned. And then came the night terrors, fits of screaming that lasted until dawn. Her voice hoarse from pleading with God to save her soul. The royal court tried to hide it at first, but Maria's episodes became too violent, too public. Her confessions grew incoherent. She refused to sign important documents, believing they were traps from the devil. She began bursting into cabinet meetings, screaming scripture and refusing to leave. She wandered the palace barefoot, muttering to herself and cursing paintings. And then came the death of her eldest son, Jose, from smallpox. Whatever thread of sanity Maria had clung to was cut that day. She collapsed and reportedly didn't speak for days. When she did, she announced that God had taken Jose as punishment for her sins. She became convinced that the royal family was being hunted by divine wrath, and that only self-inflicted suffering could stop it. But what no one knew at the time was that Maria wasn't just grieving. She was genetically doomed. Her family, the House of Braganza, had practiced generational inbreeding, often marrying within the same tight circle of Iberian royalty, including the Spanish Bourbons and earlier Habsburg lines. These families already carried a heavy legacy of mental illness. And in Portugal, that legacy exploded. Maria's father had shown signs of instability late in life. Her son, João VI, would later suffer from paralyzing anxiety, paranoia, and depression. Her grandson, Miguel, became known for irrational violence and political cruelty. Madness didn't run in the Braganza family. It ruled it. What Maria experienced was likely hereditary psychosis worsened by trauma, religious obsession, and genetic vulnerability. And unlike other monarchs, she didn't suffer in silence. She broke publicly, completely by 1792. Her condition had worsened to the point where she could no longer rule, but rather than abdicate, the crown declared her incapable and quietly transferred power to her surviving son, João, as prince regent. Maria remained queen in name, but in reality, she had become a ghost. Visitors to the royal court during this time wrote disturbing accounts. One French ambassador noted, "The queen cries constantly. She no longer recognizes anyone. She speaks. To statues, she smells of incense and wears black every day." Her chambers were redesigned to minimize noise. Servants were forbidden to make sudden movements or open windows without warning. Candles were kept lit at all hours because darkness triggered fits of screaming. Doctors tried everything: leeches, isolation, holy water. Nothing helped. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the royal family was forced to flee to Brazil, the first time a European monarchy physically relocated its court across an ocean. Maria, by then nearly catatonic, was carried aboard in. Silenced in exile, she lived in Rio de Janeiro, in a palace where her windows were barred and her name was rarely spoken. She died there in 1816, after 24 years of living madness, not just as a woman in pain, but as a symbol of an empire cracking under the weight of hereditary disease. But the tragedy didn't end with her death. Portugal, under João VI and his unstable son Miguel, spiraled into decades of civil war, colonial collapse, and dynastic instability. The royal family's madness had infected governance itself, decisions made from fear, paranoia, and cruelty, rather than policy or vision. And at the heart of it all was Maria, a queen who loved God so deeply that she couldn't understand why her prayers were never answered. Her legacy wasn't just religious devotion. It was the proof that royal inbreeding didn't need swords or poison to destroy a kingdom. It could do it quietly, in the mind, in the blood, in the night. They were born in silk and gold, crowned in cathedrals, buried in marble, but beneath the layers of velvet and velvet-lined lies, the kings and queens of Europe carried a secret they couldn't escape, a sickness hidden not in wounds, but in their blood. For centuries, monarchs believed in the sanctity of their own lineage, that royal blood must never mix with common blood, and so they married cousins, uncles, nieces. They looped their family trees into knots. They traded brides like currency, sealed alliances with genetic risk, and built dynasties that were biologically doomed from the inside out. They did this in the name of power, but what they created were genetic traps. Bloodlines that grew narrower, sicker, and more fragile with each generation. The result? A king who couldn't chew, a prince who bled from the inside, a Tsar who trusted a mystic over his generals, an empire lost to a hallucinating monarch, A queen who screamed at angels until her voice broke. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a system, a centuries-long delusion that purity meant strength, that royal blood was superior, even as it turned to poisoned science. Now tells us what those royal courts refused to believe. Genetic diversity is survival. Without it, recessive disorders emerge. Mental illness compounds, immunity falters. And once mighty families collapse, not from war but from within, we look at these stories now with horror, maybe even pity, but they hold a mirror to more than just history. They ask us, what happens when power protects itself too tightly? What's the cost of purity, tradition, and control when they defy nature itself? In the end, the greatest enemy of monarchy wasn't rebellion or revolution. It was the crown's own bloodline.